All right, so we're here on the YouTube today to talk about an article that I critique called Sport, Gender, and Ethnicity Practices of Symbolic Inclusion, Exclusion. Basically, this study is set in Norway, in Scandinavian countries as well, that are really seeking to improve the participation of teens, adolescents in sport. They've noticed that the current trend is that boys and girls are currently participating in sports at a similar rate. However, that rate is only similar when they include activities such as walking or other fitness things like yoga, which really allows for females to feel more comfortable participating. The reality is there's still some gender asymmetry that exists between sports due to the fact that sports are viewed as more masculine or more feminine, which also leads to the ways that these sports are appraised by the people that participate in them and then the society as a whole. Adolescents tend to explicitly and implicitly identify with activities along the lines of race and gender, and that's what this study is really looking to examine, is how athletes identify with sport or identify with the people that participate in sport, and how that creates basically lines drawn between genders and ethnicities in terms of who participates in what. So this notion of symbolic inclusion and exclusion in sport really just has to do with the unequal power relations, dominant meanings in society. Basically, society creates its own meaning in terms of what's appropriate and what isn't. That's reinforced throughout each generation. And one of the things that this study really reflects is that those meanings are very influential in terms of sport, in terms of who participates. The factors that contribute to inclusion and exclusion in sport are hegemonic power, meanings attributed to the body, meanings attributed to race, and participation in race and gender. So, I was going to talk about each one. No worries. I can edit it out. It's not a big deal. So, just to run through this list, hegemonic power is basically this sort of implicit notion that the people that are in power should have power and should be able to do what they've been doing. Obviously, that makes sense for the people that are in power. They want to continue to be in power, continue to make the rules, continue to benefit the most. The interesting thing to note with hegemonic power is that even groups that are sort of taken advantage of, ethnic minorities or females in this case, still tend to buy into this notion that particularly white males seem to have all the power and set up systems so that they can maintain their power without too much challenge from either races or female gender. This notion of meanings attributed to the body basically look at the way these adolescents sort of view how their body looks in relation to others and what sport that would allow them to participate in. So the main sport in Norway is soccer, which tends to place a pretty high emphasis on speed and strength. So it makes sense that males tend to identify with participation in soccer more often than females because they seem to be a bit bigger, be a bit stronger, be a bit faster. Additionally, in terms of this sort of phenomenological applied meaning that these adolescents feel is this meaning attributed to race. Rightly or wrongly, there is a stereotype that black people tend to be more athletic, and that is reflected in terms of the types of sports that they participate in. This study basically demonstrated that black people in these countries tended to participate more in sports that required speed, required strength, as opposed to dexterity, flexibility, finesse, things like that. And part of that could be due to the hegemonic power of the way the systems are set up to encourage participation, and part of that simply is because this system has sort of allowed young people to see this sort of participation reflected at every level. There has never really been a challenge to types of sports that black people should participate in or types of sports that females should participate in. It's always kind of been the same. And again, unfortunately, this is sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy in the sense that as people feel comfortable only participating in certain sports, they tend to participate in those sports and demonstrate to their peers, to their parents, to their children, that that's the sport that they chose that works for them, which unfortunately just perpetuates that cycle of participation based on race or gender, as opposed to simply picking a sport that works for you. So for this study, they basically just sent out a questionnaire to adolescent youth across Norway, basically to determine how they viewed themselves in terms of their participation and how they viewed their peers in terms of participation in athletics. The questionnaire was provided to over 1,000 people, ranging from the ages of 14 to 20. The questionnaire asked for information regarding social characteristics, sports participation, and normative images. Basically, normative images is this notion of what you would expect to see when you are participating in a sport or an activity. An example of that would be when you think of soccer, who do you see? And typically the response is white males, because they tend to have speed and power, but are also the ethnic majority, so the opportunities for them to participate at higher levels are more open to them. The questions identified reasons for the extent of participation in particular sports, which is along those lines of who have you seen participating, how does that make you feel when you see these people participating, would you feel comfortable participating in any of these sports, and so on. Questions also address the perceived gender and racial suitability of each sport. So basically that notion of, as a black woman, would you feel comfortable trying out for a soccer team at your school? And unfortunately, the results they found is that probably not. So the results. Ethnic minority females participated the least in sport. That makes sense based on the factors we discussed at the beginning, particularly this notion of hegemonic power. Unfortunately, ethnic minority females are encouraged the least to participate in sport. Systems aren't set up to allow them to participate in sport, and that really affects their comfort with trying new things or approaching sports that they may not necessarily feel comfortable doing or feel supported in participating in. And then again, ethnic majority males participated in sport the most. That makes a lot of sense as well due to that notion of hegemonic power. The participation of these ethnic majority males is really due to the fact that club systems are set up for them to participate at any level, from the most recreational to the most competitive, and really given opportunities to find a place that fits. Unfortunately, that is not extended to other groups within the country. Specific sports had the most participation regardless of ethnicity. Soccer, as the most popular sport in the country, tended to have the most participation regardless of ethnicity. That meant that black males tended to lean more towards soccer than other sports, which again speaks a bit to the acceptability of that participation. Obviously, they aren't being encouraged to try other things, or they don't feel comfortable trying other things. They still feel comfortable, trying soccer, participating in soccer, but it's not quite to the same extent that ethnic majority males, white males, would do. More girls than boys participated in mixed gender sports, which it goes into sort of that perception of participation and what is perceived as okay. Males tend to think that participating with girls is soft or weak, and that really limits the amount of activities that they feel interested in trying, simply because they don't want to play with girls. Whereas girls tend to not be as bothered by that and really be okay basically participating along with boys in other sports. So, despite the differences in rates of participation, is it feasible to hope for similar rates amongst different genders and ethnicities? It seems to be that it's not really feasible, unfortunately, because there are ethnic and cultural issues at play that tend to limit what people find acceptable. And this study really hoped to illustrate those different differences, to really make sure that people were aware of them and were willing to go against them if they felt like they were capable of. The different rates in participation really are the most dramatic between ethnic majority males and ethnic minority females. Part of that could simply come down to a cultural issue of what those ethnic minority females really feel comfortable doing. And how does sports participation affect the other aspects of the lives of ethnic minorities? One thing to keep in mind is that ethnic minorities, particularly in countries like Norway, tend to be Muslim in a lot of instances, And this notion of what females are allowed to participate in really affects their level of participation in sport. In addition to that notion and the way culturally that group operates, there's also this need for understanding in terms of the way that they participate in school. So the conclusion. So sport stimulates integration among teenagers with different socioeconomic backgrounds. So basically, regardless of your place in terms of being part of the ethnic majority, the minority, or gender, you're still going to come into contact with people that are different than you. And that's really one of the benefits, and that's one of the things that this study highlighted, was the fact that you can still meet new people, expand your horizons, really learn a lot about different cultures by participating in sport. But the problem is it's still too limited. Basically, this study really shows that the people who participate in sport will always sort of look the same and be the same, with a few exceptions. And really, ideally, what they'd like is for no one to feel uncomfortable participating in a sport. Really, everyone should be able to feel like they will be accepted as long as they, can perform the right way. And that's really all that should matter. But unfortunately, as demonstrated by this study, teens, adolescents still feel as if they should or shouldn't participate based on what they look like or what gender they're represented by. And that's part of the last two conclusions, is that sport is used by youth to distinguish and differentiate between social groups. Basically, your identification with a sport sort of affects who you interact with and who you feel comfortable around. So while yes, it can in some instances expose you to people that are different, it also really reinforces who you are similar to. This notion is reinforced throughout generation due to that participation. If a mom plays field hockey, it's likely that her daughter will at least look into field hockey, and if that pattern of participation continues, the types of people that they will meet will be limited to field hockey participants, which is not what we're looking for. And then gendered and racial ethnic normative images still structure sport involvement, which is that notion of what people feel comfortable participating in based on who they're going to be around, who they're going to be able to identify with, and who they're going to feel comfortable with. So it's important to keep this in mind whenever we are working with teams, simply because more than likely not everyone will be the same, but even more so it's possible that there will be a majority within the team and then a minority. And it's very important to make sure that you are considering basically all of the meanings created by each individual and how they bring that to the team, so that the minority never feels neglected and the majority never feels like they can get away with things that they shouldn't be able to get away with. It's also important to notice that an athlete may feel compelled to behave a certain way based on his or her race or based on the culture of the sport they happen to be a part of. This is part of that understanding piece from the first application, that notion of making sure that everyone is aware of the fact that people behave differently, people react differently to certain things, and if team members are made aware of that, they'll be more likely to feel open and honest and accepted within their groups, as opposed to feeling like they are too different or not a part of the team. They may never be able to cross that sort of obvious racial line because there is a physical difference that you can see, but it's not about the physical difference you can see, it's about feeling like you're part of this team. And by making sure people are aware of, who each person is as an individual, that line, that division, really means nothing at the end of the day, as long as you're doing it right. So here's my reference. Thank you very much. Hope everybody enjoyed it. Have a good one. Done and done.